From Genesis, the first chapter, beginning in verse 24. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." And verse 31, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day." And then into the second chapter, where there is an embellishment of the creation story. Verse 7 says, "And Jehovah God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And Jehovah God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he made." And the information continues to tell us that God took of Adam's own bone and flesh and made a help meet, or corresponding, suitable to him. Woman made from man. There was one being, from that being came two. And then as man and woman devote themselves to one another in marriage and become one again, from that oneness as originally, there comes another, and the process of creation is continued. I believe that. I believe what the Bible says about what man is, about where man came from, about what man's responsibility is. There are theories in the world today that contrast with that. We are looking at Darwinian evolution, and we will continue our study of it this evening. And before I begin, I want to tell you that I'm very confident of the material that I present. I'm confident of my viewpoint because it is from the Bible, and I have more than sufficient reasons to believe the Bible. But as far as the material I shall present to you, much of it comes from evolutionists themselves. Other of my material comes from men who are scientists and women in their own right, and who are giving evolutionist fits these days. But also I'm confident of this material, and I do not say this to boast. I say it because what people sometimes expect is, if they go to a church building and they hear someone speaking on the subject of evolution, they expect to simply disregard it as some right-wing view, some, what do they call the religious right, and on and on. But I must tell you that I have presented material along this line in college classrooms. I presented it to assembled college faculty. I've had plenty of opportunity to have my material tested. Not everyone has agreed with the conclusions, but they have not found room to fault the material. We will study the material together. You must consider the material and what you believe about it. I believe the Bible. But there is another reason I am confident of the material I shall present to you this evening. This specific material, the last time I presented it was in a public auditorium in Prague, in the Czech Republic, this past spring. I had gone there by invitation to do that. I do not know what or who everybody is or was who was present. But there are three people there who I did know about, and they interested me. And I spoke confidently before them, but I was very interested in what their reaction was going to be. One man identified himself at the reception table as an evolutionist, as a professor of genetics in the university there in Prague, though he did believe in God. And so one of the people at the reception table came down to me and said, "You have a genetics professor here this evening who is an evolutionist," and pointed him out. And so I decided while I was talking I would watch him, and I did. And he was taking notes extensively in the beginning, and there were to be questions afterwards, so I thought, what is this genetics professor going to ask me? And when the session was over, he asked one question, and it grew out of a misunderstanding. I do not know whether it was the way I expressed it or whether it came by way of translation, because everything I said was translated. But he found out that on the subject about which he asked, we agreed. And that was the only question he asked, and then he was very cordial in his remarks afterward, and he went back and took many materials from the reception table before he left to go home. That was interesting. A genetics professor, and he did not challenge what I said. He did not try to tell me I was wrong. Then there was a man there who had been an atheist. He was a heart surgeon. I had had some conversations with him, and he came to the evening that I spoke on this subject. And afterwards he commended the material. He said that it was interesting and convincing. And so I felt assured again. But perhaps the man I was most concerned about was a man whom many of you have seen, Dr. Josef Shabestov, who is a world-renowned scientist, a geneticist, a plant pathologist. He was invited to the United States by Iowa State University. The head of his department, or the department that invited him here after his 4 months, says, "Joseph, you have taught me more than the previous head of this department taught me. You taught me more in 4 months than he did in 10 years. He also lectured at the University of Minnesota. He lectured at the University of Missouri. Texas A&M sent for him information about the work he was doing, and our government took enough interest in his work that they gave him a grant to coordinate the work of scientists in Europe and the United States. His project is through genetics to develop a strain of grain, wheat, and rice that genetically will be able to resist disease and insects, and he is making progress. He discovered 4 genes that no one ever knew those grains had while he was here in the United States." I had studied many times with Joseph. He became a Christian, but we never did get to the subject of evolution. So I watched him as I began, and he was not entirely comfortable, it seems. But after a few minutes, he relaxed. And after it was over, he seemed to apologize for never having thoroughly examined the subject of evolution himself. And he said, "Dale, we were taught this and indoctrinated in this in secondary school. And as I went on into university and into my doctorate," he said, "I was studying more specifically and I did not worry about it. In all my years, I have had my work, and I have not been concerned about it. But you did an effective job in pointing out the weaknesses of the theory of evolution. I was gratified. So as I speak this evening, the things you will hear have been things that have been tested. There have been astute scientists who have listened to this material, and that without complaint. I want to again emphasize what we're talking about when we talk about evolution. I am not talking about adaptation through natural selection. I believe that the unfit will not survive. But eliminating things through natural selection is not what evolution needs. Evolution needs something that will originate, and natural selection only eliminates. The process of evolution does not work through adaptation by natural selection. I'm not talking about varieties. I'm not talking about selective breeding. I'm not talking about reaching as far as genes can reach. I'm talking about new genes, new genetic information coming into being that can produce new life forms. Do not believe that can happen. I do not believe it has happened. I do not believe anyone can show a way that it can happen. So when we believe in varieties, when we believe in adaptation, when we believe in selective breeding, if evolution simply means change, can change occur in living forms of life? Without doubt, and without question, and observably so. So, I guess anyone observing life carefully at all must believe in evolution with a small e. We talked about the roses last evening and new varieties that are developed all of the time. But it draws from a gene pool, and there's an optimum that it can reach, and there are limits beyond which roses can go. And no matter how much change takes place inside the family of roses, the roses never will become an apple tree. Evolution needs to come up with something that makes roses turn into apple trees. Change, yes. Microevolution within bounds. We studied in the Bible just a moment ago that everything is to produce after its kind. That does not even use the word species. It says kind. Where something has the ability to interbreed, that is a kind. Changes can occur, but there are limits to that change. Genetics determines that. We are talking about evolution with a capital E, macro, large evolution, that turns alligators into birds, that turns apes into men. That is the kind of evolution that we are talking about. That is the kind of evolution we believe is impossible. We saw last evening that the evolutionists cannot prove that life came from non-life, and he must do that. If he is going to ungod the world, which really I believe is what Darwin's purpose was, if he's going to explain everything naturally without God, he is going to have to bring life into existence at some time, because he is not going to believe in an eternal, I believe in an eternal life, and that is offensive to him. He believes that life had a beginning. But where did life come from? How could it develop? Last evening we took a look at the cell. How did the first cell come into being? And we saw in cells amino acids and lipids and porphyrin and DNA. We saw that there are things inside the cell that cannot exist together except in a living cell. They would destroy one another naturally. And yet there they are in the living cell. But if they would destroy one another naturally, how are they going to get together and form a living cell? To have a living cell, you have to have a living cell to produce it. There is no way to have life come into being from non-life. Life comes from life. We saw that there is no mechanism to produce characters of life that do not exist. If you started with worms that have no sight, I do not care how many mutations their genes may have, You do not have a gene for sight. You do not have a gene for seeing. And without that gene, I do not care how many of its genes may mutate, it does not have a gene to mutate that will create an eye. Mutations deform the genes and the features and the qualities we have. They do not originate new qualities. The other thing that evolution needs then, if it cannot show how life came into being and that life can come from non-life, and if it cannot tell us a mechanism whereby an alligator changes into a bird or a rose plant changes into an apple tree, then let it show us it has happened. Let them show us that it is happening somewhere. And that cannot be done. So then let them show us it has happened. And the only place they can look is the fossil record, and that is where we are going to look this evening. That leaves the fossil record to inform us as to whether or not Darwinian evolution has taken place. And here's a scientist who says that. This man, his name is W.R. Thompson. He's director of the Commonwealth, the Institute of Biological Control in Ottawa, Canada. W.R. Thompson is his name, and he says, therefore, if we found in the geological strata, in the layers of the Earth's crust, if we found a series of fossils showing a gradual transition from simple to complex forms, if we could find in the fossil record algae turning into a cephalopod, if we could find a cephalopod turning into a fish, if we could find a fish turning into a frog, this is what he is saying, a gradual transition from simple to complex forms, and could be sure that they correspond to a true time sequence, then we should be inclined that Darwinian evolution had occurred, even though its mechanisms remain unknown. We challenged the mechanism, and its mechanism remains challenged, and it is giving the evolutionists a great deal of trouble today. But what about the fossil record? Are we going to find there simple life forms turning into more complex forms? I'm going to read to you from Darwin's Origin of the Species. This is from the Harvard Classics edition, page 178 and 179. These quotes are taken from. And Darwin says this. What we're talking about now is, if we started digging out here in my backyard and dug down so far, would we find apes? And if we dug a little bit further down, would we find lower forms of mammals? And if we dug a little further down, would we find birds? And a little further down, and then find alligators? And a little further down, find fish? And a little further down, find evidence of worms? And then finally, algae? Is that what we would find if we started digging out there? This is what Charles Darwin said. First, he's talking about objections to his theory. Why, if species have descended from other species by fine gradations, you have a little life form here that forms a little new quality, just a little one. You've got a little rat, and there are little bumps that begin out on his side, and they begin to grow, and they form a leading edge, and they begin to become scalloped, and finally along the backs, after many, many generations, and finally he becomes a bat. Can you imagine how many slow gradations and changes there had to be between the rat and the bat? If all of those occurred, Darwin is saying, why do we, and if that happens, why do we not everywhere see in the present world, why do we not see innumerable transitional forms? Have you ever wondered that? If evolution is such a valid principle, why don't we see it happening? Why is not all nature in confusion instead of the species being, as we see them, well-defined, or as the Bible says, after their own kind? What Darwin says is, what we see is what the Bible describes. Why don't we see what I believe? Passing from that, he looks to the fossil record and he says, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. He says you look in the rocks and you do not find the missing links. The changes are not there. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record, but 145 years of continuing to search, finding whole fossil graveyards and the abundance of fossils that we have now, saying that the fossil record is inadequate is itself an inadequate explanation. And there are many creationists, there are many evolutionists who are giving up, expecting to find what should be there, and they are seeking themselves different explanations. What does Darwin say in his Life and Letters, Volume 3, page 25? He says, there are 2 or 3 millions of species on Earth, but it must be said today, in spite of all of the efforts of all of the trained observers, not one change of one species into another is on record. They cannot produce life from non-life. They cannot tell us the mechanism by which one form of life changes into another life. We saw one evolutionist saying that we cannot find it there, but we can find it in geology and in the rocks. Then we can at least prove it whether we understand that it has happened or not. Darwin is saying we cannot prove it. And 145 years later, what he says is still so. There is not one life form in all of the rocks that is in the process of turning into something else. People speak of the missing link. In a moment, we will get an idea of how many, just an idea, of how many missing links there are. Again, in his Life and Letters, Charles Darwin says, we cannot prove that a single species has changed. That indeed, I believe, is a damaging censure of Darwinian evolution. His ideas are not found in the fossil record. No wonder then, as I repeat a couple of things I told you last evening, that Colin Patterson, who was the chief paleontologist of the British Museum, came to the United States in 1981, and he assembled scientists over here in New York City at the Field Museum, not the Field Museum, the Museum of Natural History. And he said to them, I woke up one morning after 20 years of teaching evolution and asked myself what I knew for a fact about evolution. And I decided I did not know anything for sure. What do you know for sure about evolution? And the response from those assembled scientists who have a museum that advances the theory of evolution said nothing. They did not know anything for sure about evolution. He went to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, larger than the one here in New York City. He assembled scientists there and he asked them the question, what do you know for sure about evolution? No one volunteered anything they knew for sure about evolution. He went a little further south to the University of Chicago, and he asked the faculty there and those assembled, what do you know for sure about evolution? And no one could tell anything they knew for sure about evolution. And yet, in the popular media, in the Time Life series, on television, in children's cartoons, it is taken for granted. In our schools, it is taught as if it were fact. People have been fired. People have been denied their doctorate because they did not believe the theory of evolution. And yet, what do the evolutionists know for sure? Nothing. As I mentioned, there was one thing they decided for sure, and it was that evolution ought not to be taught in school as fact, but it is. There are little biology teachers running around in high school teaching it as fact, looking down their noses in a superior fashion to any child who might question them, and I resent that. And they need to know the things that we are talking about this evening. Well, let's look at the fossil record again, as we started with Charles Darwin. And here is a quotation with reference to it again. David G. Kitts put it this way: despite the bright promise that paleontology, that's studying what's in the rocks, the life forms there, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. That's from an article in Evolution, volume 28, September 1974. The evidence for evolution is not in the rocks. We are hearing that confirmed over and over again, and these are not accusations being made by anti-evolutionists. These are confessions being made by evolutionists themselves. Well, I want you to see what is affirmed. This is another evolutionary source. It is Geology Today. It was published in 1972 by the University of California, Berkeley. And it says this: in the early, is this overkill? It may be. But if it is overkill, if it kills it, I don't care if it's overkill. In the early days of the evolutionary theory, it was recognized that the fossil record could furnish the ideal proof of evolution if it were not for the extensive gaps in the fossil record. Because of the fossil record's lack of a precise absolute time scale and any evidence regarding parent-daughter relationships. What does that say? In the geological record, there is no evidence of parent-daughter relationships. There is no evidence of where man, who is supposed to be a daughter or descendant of the apes, came from the apes. There is no record of where the birds, being a daughter of the reptiles, came from the reptiles, or anything else. And this is an evolutionary source. Paleontologists have not been able to add any appreciable detail to contemporary knowledge of how the evolutionary process works. Well, I think we can drop the subject then of the fossil record as to what is there and what is not there, and let's take a look then at what is missing. You hear people speak of the missing links. This does not begin to show the variety of the forms of life that there are. We'll get to this on another chart in just a moment. But just in a very general sense, here are the various forms of life that are to be found throughout the rocks in these supposed different periods. When I was in college, we came from amoebas, but that's passé. Now, you really got started in blue-green algae. Algae is where you came from. And somehow or another, due to changes in blue-green algae, the sea worms came into existence, and then the insects, and the fish, and then the amphibians, and the reptiles, and the birds, and the mammals, and the quadruped mammals, and the apes, and man. And you hear people talk about the missing links. Look, there are missing links here. There are missing links here. There are missing links here. There are missing links there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there, and there. With all of the millions of years that supposedly this has been taking place, can you imagine how long it took to go from here to there, or from there to there? Surely there were forms of life that lived there. Where are they? They are nowhere. Why are they nowhere? Can we suggest that they did not exist? These are there. These are there. Where are all the millions and millions of transitional forms between that and that, or that and that? They simply are not there. I'm going to be tedious for just a moment. Tedium is just a part of this lesson tonight, though it ought to liven up in just a bit. I want to read to you, and there are 7 pages here of different forms of life and what scientists who are evolutionists themselves say about their ancestry. Now remember, we supposedly came from the apes, and the apes came from other mammals, and those other mammals, including whales, came from birds, who came from reptiles, who came from amphibians, who came from fish. And that's all laid out nice and neat in your children's textbooks. And you need to watch what your children are studying in school. We'll come way up the chain of life to spiders. We have no evidence to show that spiders have been derived from any other living or extinct group of arachnids. That's the family that spiders are in. Insects. There is, however, no fossil evidence bearing on the question of insect origin. Fleas. The origin of fleas, too, remains obscure. The echinoderms, starfish, sea urchins. The fossil record of the echinoderms is one of the best, but the record does not throw light upon the origin of the phylum, nor upon its possible relations to other phyla, the vertebrates, animals with backbones, spines. As our present information stands, however, the gap remains unbridged, and the best place to start the evolution of the vertebrates is in the imagination. Fish. The geological record has so far provided no evidence as to the origin of fishes. The reptiles. There is no direct proof from the fossil record, but we can readily hypothesize, guess, the conditions under which the origin of the reptiles, came about. Snakes. The place where snakes originated is unknown. Their family tree is still adorned with question marks rather than branches. Birds. Nearly a century after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, there are still monumental problems that remain to be settled about the succession of life. This is especially true of birds. The rodents. The question of their origin must be left open. Rabbits and hares. The origin of these animals is uncertain. Elephants. The origin is obscure. Sea cows. Their origin is still a mystery to men of science. Aardvarks the same. Horses. The real origin of horses is unknown. Well, I thought it came from little Eohippus. That's passé, and you've just not been keeping up if you think that. Now, using an evolutionary time scale, horses such as our modern horses now have been found that far precede that little animal, which was simply a little animal that became extinct. There's no evidences that horses came from them. Yet, you will find in your children's school books Eohippus growing and growing until it becomes a horse. That's found in the imagination like some of the other of these things. The primates. How much of this to read? It is clear that the earliest primates are not yet known. Man. There is still no general agreement as to where true Homo sapiens, the men of our own species, developed. Each authority has his own theory for which he will fight like a mother for her child, and that's exactly right. And then finally, everything. We do not actually know the phylogenetic history of any group of plants or animals since it lies in the undecipherable past. All of that being so, it appears to me that the evolutionist could be a little more humble, not so dogmatic, and certainly not as arrogant as he is today. But if you've ever opposed them, and if you've ever watched the news and what they think about what they call the religious right, you can see the abundance of arrogance that is there. But how, if that is so, did all of this come to look so impressive? When I was in school, we felt that the fossil record was our greatest enemy if we believed in God, and that is the popular field. Doesn't that prove evolution? It does not even come close from all of the information we have looked at. But again, how did it come to be so impressive? Well, here's the geological column, the different forms of life. And this, of course, is just very, very brief. But here's what happened. They find a crustacean in a rock somewhere. And they bring it someplace and they put it here. And they find a saber-toothed tiger and evidence from his tooth or some part of his body somewhere. And they bring it and they put it here in the sequence. And they find an ape and they put it here in the sequence. And they find a coelacanth and they put it here in the sequence. And they keep finding all of these things. And they put them where they should be according to the theory of evolution. Then when they're over, they're through, they say, look at that. Evolution. Well, they're the ones who put it together according to the theory. And of course, the theory is that the complex has come from the simple. Well, we can examine that. If you have things that are similar, and one is more complicated than the other, does that mean that the one more complicated came from the other? What about the paintings of Van Gogh? Aren't there similarities there? You can look at that and say, I can tell you who painted that. Van Gogh painted that. Whether you've ever seen the name on it or not. Oh, there's another Van Gogh, because you recognize some similarity. Similarity is there, and so they say one came from the other. Did Van Gogh's irises come from this one that looks like he's had a dose of cocaine and is seeing stars? No. It is simply his style imprinted upon his creation. Similarity does not necessarily indicate descent. And some of you have heard me go through this process. We will go back about 500 million years, and there was a little earthquake, and a rock up here on top of a mountain was shook loose, and it rolled down the hill, and it happened to hit in such a way that it was carved into planes on the side, but very round on the outside, and when it got to the bottom, it was a wheel. And so, using its newfound ability to roll, it rolled around for millions of years, but it got bored with doing that, and so with urges in itself and powers resident within itself, it began to push something out on the side there, and it kept growing. But as you know, a mutation seems it would begin to give you trouble if you're rolling along and you've got this thing sticking out there. It's going to stop and get you. So it just formed a wheel on the other side. Now you've got a pair of wheels. That wasn't much use, so it began to grow something on its back, and after a few million years it had a bed, and it was an ox cart. And somewhere or another an ox developed to pull the ox cart, but that was kind of unwieldy. It would go backward and forward on its wheels, so it sprouted another pair of wheels up front after a few million years. And given a few million more years with powers resident, I mean, you can see, can't you see some similarity between a wagon and an ox cart and a wheel? And it developed an internal combustion engine and a windshield and windshield wipers and air conditioner and a transmission. It developed all sorts of things that became an automobile. And one day, driving along the highway, it came to the top of a hill and hit it with pretty good speed, and it just felt, I can almost just keep going. So with that thought and powers resident in itself, it began to sprout things on the side. And after a few million years, they grew out there and developed another kind of engine. You had an airplane. And after a while, that just got streamlined. It kept reaching higher and higher so that it became a rocket to take it to the moon. Now you can line those things up from the simple to the complex with powers resident within itself and no outside energy or design put in. Did the rocket come and descend from the wheel? Again, if I told you that this evening, you would know what kind of siren vehicle to call for me tonight and where to take me. But that is what the evolutionists insist has taken place. You go from the simple to the complex must have come from the simple. And because you can line them up in order, as they have lined them up there, it proves one came from the other. I can line the rocket up and back here beginning with the wheel, and I can line it in order. Does that prove one came from the other? No, in each case there was design and there was energy applied according to design, and something new came into being. And it's not unreasonable to conclude that that is exactly what has happened with the different forms of life. There was the design in the mind of God, and He applied His energy, and He made the different life forms. The evidence that we have, that does not prove evolution. It does not prove evolution. They first of all put it together and suggest to you that it must prove evolution, and it does not any more than the sequence we lined up proves that the rocket ship came from forces resident within itself or in a wheel from the wheel. I must say again, not one form of life has been found in the process of acquiring or achieving the characteristics to turn it into a higher form of life. Which brings us to the long evolutionary ages. How old is the universe? Well, if you take the steady state theory, it is 4 6/10 billion years old. Now we have to modify that something. When I started studying this with some avidity 25 years ago, it was 4 6/10 billion years. So now it's 4 6/10 billion plus 25 years. That's how long the universe has been here. But if you follow the Big Bang Theory and the idea that the universe is expanding, it has been here 15 billion years. But all of that is theoretical. And the Big Bang Theory is in a lot of trouble today. There are a lot of people making valid objections to it. But is there anything that is measurable? Yes, there is something that is measurable. Let's talk about solar neutrinos. They bear upon the subject of the age of the Earth and Sun. A neutrino is an atomic particle, as small as any particle in the universe. It is so small it can penetrate the densest of matter. Going through that wall over there would be no problem at all for it. It is as close as something can be to nothing and still be something. And solar neutrinos are the only known particles to reach the Earth directly from the core of the Sun. 26 years ago, Raymond Davis of the University of Pennsylvania developed a solar neutrino trap in the home state mine near Deadwood, South Dakota. The neutrinos tell us about the quantity of helium in the Sun. To the best of our knowledge, the Sun shines by converting hydrogen to helium. Thus, the amount of helium in the Sun is dependent upon how long the Sun has been shining. A Sun 4 billion or 15 billion years old, converting hydrogen to helium all that time, would give us one amount of neutrinos. A young Sun would give us far fewer. Before I tell you whether we get few or many, let me tell you of a remarkable statement made by John Eddy of the High Altitude Observatory, Boulder, Colorado, and reported in Geotimes, September 1978. The article says, "There is no evidence," quoting Eddy, "based solely on solar observations, that the Sun is 4.5 minus 5 times 10 to the 9th power years old. I suspect," he said, "that the Sun is 4.5 billion years old." So you see where he is coming from. He has evolutionary presuppositions. That is what he thinks about the age of the universe. But the article continues. However, given some new and unexpected results to the contrary, and some time for frantic recalculation and theoretical readjustment, I suspect that we could live with Bishop Ussher's value for the age of the Earth and Sun. I don't think we have much in the way of observational evidence in astronomy to conflict with that. He speaks of observational evidence in astronomy. And from observational evidence in astronomy, he finds nothing to conflict with an age for the Earth of about 6,000 years. Well, Eddy spoke of those unexpected results, and what was unexpected was the negligible number of neutrinos reaching us, indicating low helium content in the Sun's core, indicating a young age. Even the 6,000 years of Archbishop Ussher's Bible chronology would be acceptable according to something we can objectively measure. Even most creationists think that Ussher made some assumptions that were wrong and missed some generations in his calculating, and thus they postulate an age to the sun and the earth of 10,000 to 15,000 years. But the results of this experiment led Roger Ulrich of the University of California, Los Angeles, to conclude this regarding evolutionary theory as far as the age of the universe is concerned. Ulrich says, the theory of stellar evolution is challenged in a very fundamental way. This discrepancy between the theory and observation, a discrepancy between the theory and observation, raises the possibility that the theory is incorrect, so that our conclusions based on the theory can no longer be accorded complete confidence. I'm grateful to see that kind of statement and admission made. It is something we have been calling for a long time. Thus, Jesse L. Greenstein has called evolution's expectations and actual observation a large discrepancy. The results, as you can guess, is that few neutrinos are reaching us. So regardless of all the very old dates hypothesized for the age of the earth and the fossils found therein, there is evidence that all those ancient ages of millions and billions of years are just wrong, and that the theory of evolution, which needs all those long and ancient ages, is wrong. Other indications of a young earth are the meteoric dust, including nickel, on the earth and moon. After billions of years of existence, there should be much more than we find. And then one considers the amount of salt that is washed into the ocean. Ocean salinity should be far more dense if salt has been washing into the ocean for 5 billion or 15 billion years, and there is insufficient sediment and decay collection in the ocean's bottom to suggest great antiquity. Also, you will remember the book I told you about last night, written by the British scientist Richard Milton. He's not a Bible believer, but he has written a book entitled The Facts of Life, Shattering the Myth of Darwinism. In it, he reports this: Dr. Melvin Cook, a former professor of metallurgy at the University of Utah, whose radiocarbon dating methods have put the age of the Earth's atmosphere between 10,000 and 15,000 years, said, the facts do not support the theory of evolution. Here is an accepted dating method, and dating the Earth's atmosphere, we reach a figure of only 10,000 to 15,000 years in age. But what of more recent methods cited by the evolutionists, such as potassium-argon, measuring the decay of potassium into argon to date material? Momentarily, we will examine how much confidence the evolutionists themselves place in these methods when their dates do not suit them. But now back to Richard Milton, and he says, experiments by scientists at the Hawaiian Institute of Geophysics using radioactive decay of potassium to argon to date volcanic lavas found ages ranging from 160 million to 3 billion years. How accurate can it be? That's quite a discrepancy. And yet he said, in fact, the rocks are known to be only 190 years old. 190 years old and dated at 3 billion years. There has to be something questionable about that method of dating. And he says, this example can be repeated many times. So what I want to do now is look at some intriguing games that are played with dating. But to do that, let me go down here and put this chart on the projector. They use things, you got all these great ages. And this next chart is going to take a little bit of explanation. Have you got a minute? Okay. This is the latest scheme of man coming from the apes, but don't blink, it may change. And this has been changed all over through the years, and especially in recent years. And what you have back here is Ramapithecus, an ape-like creature, and supposedly the modern apes have descended from him. Here we have 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago, 3 million years ago, 4 million years ago. And also by some means, there is Australopithecus afarensis, who is Lucy, of which many of you, I'm sure, have heard. And there she is right there. And having somehow come from Ramapithecus, she is the mother of Australopithecus robustus, who is the father of Australopithecus bossii, or Zinjanthropus, that you may have heard of, supposedly. Also, Lucy is the mother of Australopithecus africanus, from which the tongue child is one, who is the parent of Homo habilis about 2 million years ago, and Homo erectus about 1.5 million years ago, a little over 1 million years ago, and then finally Homo sapiens coming into existence, archaic, 1 million years ago, Neanderthal man going over here, and modern man going off here. And that's the idea. Well, when we look at this, we've got Australopithecus africanus. And when this was found, because it needed to be 3 million years old, this is where they put the tongue child, discovered in 1924, a skull discovered. But several years later, in the 60s, it was discovered that the cave where the skull was found could not have been formed more than 3/4 million years ago. That means the tongue child belongs up here. So it couldn't be in this line. They had to put it over here. And yet the tongue child was more advanced or less advanced than some of these creatures behind it. And so they did not know what to do with Mr. Australopithecus africanus for a long while. But since this objection was lodged and recognized as long ago as 20 years, and nobody is continuing to make the objection, he snuck back in over here, back down here. The fact still is that the cave, using their chemical methods of dating, showed that the skull cannot be older than 3/4 million years. How much do they rely upon their chemical methods of dating? Not at all when it doesn't please them. They throw that out and they put Australopithecus africanus, the tongue child, back here where the theory of evolution says he should go, regardless of all of their dating methods. Then there is the find of a skull which never has been given a name. KNMER 1470, Kenyan National Museum, from East Rudolph, acquisition 1470. I remember when Richard Leakey found this. The problem with it is, and this is the problem evolutionists are beginning to have, they would find something and they would date the stratum by what they found there, and they had found little enough that gave them no problem. But here is a stratum that, because of pig remains, elephant remains, and some artifacts, and even some tools they found there, they dated at 2 million years ago. No, in fact, 2.9 million years ago. I've got to back it up. Their first application of the potassium argon test gave them dates of 212 million years to 230 million years ago. But the apes and the elephants that they found there, the pigs and the elephants that they found there, and the tools that they found there couldn't be that old. But that's what their test said. So they said, well, the samples we've got must have accumulated other argon. They had been contaminated by other samples around them. So they went and got other samples, and they got other samples until they finally found some samples that dated 2.9 million years. And that's where it ought to fit. So that's the one they accepted. How did they know that's not contaminated? How did they know that didn't lose some argon? If some of these other things could lose argon and attach itself to these samples, when they got a sample that said 2.9 million years, how do they know that has what? They don't. And so that's how they use their dating methods. They keep playing with the samples until they get one the theory of evolution should agree with. But below that stratum, Richard Leakey found his skull. And I remember when it hit the magazines, the newspaper, and the evening news. And it was, here is man in modern form, essentially as we are now, 3 million to 3.5 million years ago. Now listen, I've got to tell you, I'm using evolutionary time scale. I don't believe in these numbers. I'm using them accommodatively. I'm using their numbers. What that throws out is all the rest of the Homo habilis specimens. You've got man older than that. He's older than the tongue child. He's older than Neanderthal man. Modern man is older than all of these. When I was in school, this was the progression. 1 million years ago, there was Pithecanthropus erectus, Java man, 1 million years old. Shortly after that, there was Scianthropus Peking man. And after that, Piltdown man, who has now been proved to be a hoax. And after that, Neanderthal man, and after that, Cro-Magnon man. Well, finally, we had to say Cro-Magnon man was a modern man. And you'd be surprised what has happened now that the Neanderthal man, see, he's right up here with Homo sapiens. He's not a modern man. He's just a little different, a little rougher looking man, really, is what he was. And he has gone off and become extinct, and here we are over here nice and pretty. But Neanderthal man is one of us. But you see, if we have man back here over 3 million years, that throws this whole thing out. And I mean, they argued for the next 10 years. But they said, but we've got these elephant samples. But they said also, but we've got these pig samples. And there were those who fought between the elephants and between the pigs. And they finally dated the pigs at 1.9 million years. So the pigs won, and KNMER 1470 was put back here 1.9 million years ago. I didn't know that until I got a National Geographic magazine. And when it said it was showing the layout of the descent of man, I wanted to see what they did. And I was surprised that this modern creature has been put back here with Homo habilis, with some little creatures that barely stood 3 feet tall, and here's a creature that would stand over 5 feet tall, but they've got to put him back here, or else they've got to ruin this whole scheme of things. And they had to work off, you know what that says? How much did they rely on potassium argon? They didn't. They relied upon the pigs, is what they relied upon. And so when they start telling you how old something is, and they tell you with great certainty because they dated it with potassium argon or thorium lead or radiocarbon dating, they keep playing with the samples till they get the dates they want. And this discussion has gotten less than polite. I read where one man examining this said something that would have been unthinkable 10, 15 years ago, but they're getting bold looking at this and how foolish some of it is. And he said, I don't know what you call that, but I know what my mother called it, and she wouldn't allow me to do very much of it. Well, that's his assessment, but I just want you not to have any great respect for this potassium argon dating, thorium lead dating, or the radiocarbon dating. As far as dating is concerned, let's take a couple of other quotations. How much do they depend upon these methods of dating? And I've read other statements like this one also. This is just typical. This is from Professor R.A. Sturton, director of the Museum of Paleontology of the University of California, and he says, biologic correlations, those things we looked at a while ago, are still the most useful method in our efforts to establish relative contemporaneity of events throughout the geologic past. They are based on the history of life as represented by fossils in the rock. What did he say? He says we really depend upon dating in the most useful form by looking at the fossils in the rocks and dating according to that. Well, what does that mean? It means that they date the fossils by the rocks they are in, and they date the rocks by the fossils that are there. And that is not simply an accusation. Listen to this admission. And in fact, the book Geology Today that I quoted a while ago said, sometimes geologists are accused of circular reasoning here, and in a fashion, it is, and that's true. And here is this statement. Fossils thus make it possible to recognize rocks of the same age in different parts of the earth. You see, if it's got a fossil of a fish, it's got to be the same age as this fossil of a fish. So when they put it in their time scale, they bring it and they put it right there. Fossils thus make it possible to recognize rocks of the same age in different parts of the earth, and in this way to correlate events and work out the history of the earth as a whole. They're saying, they're just what I told you a moment ago. They furnish us with a chronology on which events are arranged like pearls on a string. In this, and this is that quotation from Geology Today I've written at the bottom of this page, geologists have been accused of using circular reasoning, and in a sense it is. And then R.H. Rastall says, it cannot be denied that from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined, the organisms and their succession have been determined by study of their remains embedded in the rocks. And the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms they contain. Now, I've told you this little story before about the cartoon where there was a little geologist and his little geologist hat and his little short pants, and he's got his little pick and he's pecking away at this rock. And he pulls something loose and says, Eureka, I have found it. What have you found? I found this 500 million year old fish. How do you know that fish is 500 million year old? Why? Because it's in this 500 million year old rock. Oh, how do you know that rock is 500 million years old? Why? Because it had this 500 million year old fish in it. Now that's exactly what I have been reading to you, and that is the most useful means of dating they have. Now that may not sound kind, but they're faced with it and they admit it obliquely, and perhaps we have just made the accusation a little bit more oblique than they have been willing to do this. But I want to go back to the chemical methods of dating just briefly once again, and then we'll leave that subject and get on to something else. As to its significance, the study of the 10-year controversy in dating the KBS tuff, that is the stratum beneath which this fossil was found, this skull was found by Leakey, Richard Leakey, is tremendously revealing. Whereas the public is led to believe that these dating methods are highly objective and accurate, the scientific literature itself reveals that they are highly subjective. There is no question that rock samples are often manipulated to give a desired result, and we saw how they did that. There's also no question that this manipulation is done in the utmost sincerity and with the noblest motives, but it is manipulation nonetheless. The bad material must be removed to allow the good material to be dated, but there is no way of knowing for sure which material is good and which is bad. The decision, I've written this in to summarize it, the decision about what is good material is material that agrees with the age the material should be according to the evolutionary theory. And if you don't get an age that agrees with the evolutionary material, that is the bad material that you throw out, and this is how they date things and do it so authoritatively. Well, we can move on pretty hastily here. I think there's several things I want to cover. I've got 10 minutes before I go as long as I did last evening. If you need to leave, folks, listen, I understand. The benches are hard, and this is tedious material. I'll not feel bad if you have to get up and go. But if you can wait 10 more minutes, I'm not going to promise. If you wait a few more minutes, we will finish this. I mentioned Ramapathecus back here. What I want to start showing you is there's no line of descent here. There's no line of descent here, and there's no line of descent here. these really all go together. This guy goes with all of these, and they go together. Ramapithecus goes right up here with our modern apes. Dr. Robert Eckert, paleontologist at Penn State University, has identified our high-altitude baboons with the same facial, dental, and jaw characteristics living today in Ethiopia as Ramapithecus. This guy doesn't belong back here. Look at that 4.5 million years. We'll tell you something about that in just a moment. He doesn't belong back here. He may have lived in their time scale back then. He may have lived a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago. Nothing here on earth is that old. But he's living up here today, or very, very exceedingly close cousin of his is living up here today. Here is Homo habilis that we've described, and we've looked at Richard Leakey's skull. The strange thing is that Homo habilis, all the specimens, have a domed skull, a thin cranium, and a gracial appearance. That means they're pretty, like we are. On the other hand, as you go up the scale of evolution, you come to Homo erectus, and he has a sloped skull, a thick cranium, and a robust appearance. That means he's got a heavy brow ridge, and he's really mean and tough looking. And what happened? You went from thin skull and pretty looking to thick skull and ugly looking, and then you come back to thin skull and good looking again, like all of us are. Well, they're stuck with that because they've got to keep this guy back here. They can't let him go all the way back here, and they worked out the scheme we went through a moment ago, get him there, so they're going to leave him there, whether he fits there or not. So you've got this 1470 character, and he cannot be classified as man. The reason is because man couldn't have lived back here. So we'll see. And just keep your eye on that 4.5 million years. There are footprints in the Carboniferous period. That is 300 million years ago, which puts them here. They are human footprints, and they are found in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Kentucky, and Maryland. And the strata they are found in are dated what they are because they find these kind of fossils there. But there's also evidence of man there. But why aren't those footprints, I mean, we know what a human footprint looks like. Why are they not accepted as human footprints? Pascal says, and this is an evolutionary source, Fossil Man, page 109, we must be able to doubt where doubt is needful. That's like the footprints out in the Paluxy River Valley, where there are dinosaur footprints, and they have been played up in Ballyhooton. There's a dinosaur museum there. But old-timers remember that down underneath the silt in that stream of that creek, there were human footprints. So they pumped all of that out and found human footprints. But they really got too ambitious. They took away the bank also in the same stratum. They found more dinosaur footprints, and they found some indecipherable footprints, but they were smaller. So they called that human and hypothesized that the human was running from the dinosaurs. Well, the evolutionists have really made capital of that. They have proved to their satisfaction, and they may be right, that those are really baby dinosaur footprints going along with the big mother dinosaur. And I even saw a special on television where they're looking down under the water with these in the creek bed through a box saying, see, those aren't human, and making all sorts of fun of that. But they completely ignored the really human footprints that are there. I've seen molds of them, I've seen casts of them, I've seen pictures of them, I've talked to people who have seen them, and they are there. I saw a geologist interviewed, and he was asked, are these human footprints? And he said, no. And he says, why not? He said, because humans didn't live then. This is when the dinosaurs lived. Folks, did dinosaurs live? Yes, they just didn't live 70 million years ago. They lived contemporaneously with man. Sometimes they became extinct, like other animals have become extinct. And what about them, though? Well, they are clever carvings. There is a way they could have proved that. They could have done what some men I know did. They got permission to go out and dig up, cut away from the stone, one of these footprints. So here is the bottom of the footprint. There's the ball of the foot, here's the heel, here are the toes. If that is a carving, the material underneath it is going to be like that. I mean, you've got hard rock, and somebody just carves it out. You're not going to disturb what is underneath it. They cut away a cross section, and they found underneath the print striations, pressure striations. It was not a carving. It is a footprint. But will evolutionists accept that? No. Why? Because man didn't live with dinosaurs. Well, you can be the judge of that. Then there's Minnesota man, who was found in a Pliocene stratum in Minnesota, obviously, and judged to be 1 million years old, therefore, but he was rejected as being back here with Homo erectus, because his skull was identical to some Indian skulls that were found nearby. And fossil man has an explanation for that. They say fossil man must differ from living man. Since his skull was like the Indian skulls, then we cannot accept his skull as prehistoric man. Well, that leads to this. I'm going to show you what his head looked like, what some other heads look like. This is the most interesting chart I've got. This is a skull of Homo erectus, supposedly 500,000 years ago. This is a skull that we know, like those Indians, found in the Camp Swamp in Australia. We know cannot be older than 10,000. Now, this is using their time scale. This is modern man. This is Homo sapiens sapiens. This is one of us. How much difference do you see in that skull? Here is the difference. Here is the one that is supposed to be the oldest, Homo erectus. Why? His skull is not as sloped as much as this modern man's skull is sloped. It has a higher ball, has a larger brain capacity than this modern man's. Here is this modern man's skull. Here is old Homo erectus and his skull. What does that suggest to you? Doesn't that suggest that these people don't necessarily have to be separated by 500,000 years? And maybe old Homo erectus is just modern man. The fact is that there are different conformations genetically and also by culture. Arthur Cummins, an anthropologist, has said you can change the conformation of the skull simply by taking away from a man the knife and feeding him a tough meat diet. And it will cause brow ridges. There will have to be something for the muscles to anchor on. It will give him a stronger jaw. This created simply by culture. Then there is just wide genetic variability. Look at dogs. If these evolutionists hadn't seen dogs, and I had the skull of a little Chihuahua and the skull of a Great Dane and brought them to them, they would think I had a brilliant find, and they would put this one back 1.5 million years and this one as a modern dog. And look at all the varieties, or Pekingese and his shaped skull, the different shaped skulls in dogs. And the fact is that man has the ability to have many different shaped skulls. And this is simply what that says. And this is what I believe they're going to have to come to, and it looks as if some of them already are, and they're being pressed by some astute people. That you take Richard Leakey's Homo habilis, which even was more modern than Homo erectus that we looked at here a while ago. And you take Homo erectus, which looks like modern man, as you saw, and you take Homo sapiens, and all of these are simply man. Well, we've got to wind this up. The fact is that men with the skull shape of Java man can be found in the Bushmen of Africa and among the Australian Aborigines today. And men with skulls the shape of Neanderthal man can be found among Eskimos living in this century. And that is why, grudgingly, Neanderthal has lost his monster image and characteristics, has been factually represented and elevated to humanity. What that means is that all the Homo specimens are in reality humans, not ancestors to humans. and Australopithecus africanus is just another Australopithecine. And all the Australopithecines, beginning with Lucy, are just a specialized ape that has become extinct. To support the idea that all the Homo fossils are in reality human, simply humans with varied skull morphology or shape, and that less pretty skulls do not keep anyone from being human, listen to Dr. Robert Eckerd, a paleoanthropologist at Penn State. Amid the bewildering array of early fossil hominids, is there one whose morphology marks it as man's hominid ancestor? Do you see what he has asked? He has said, of all of these ancient skulls and bones that we have found, is there anyone that can be marked as an ancestor of man? And he answers, if the factor of genetic variability is considered, the answer appears to be no. He is simply saying there are different morphologies, different shaped skulls. That does not make one ancestor to another. That is just evidence of genetic variability. But about this 4.5 million years I have at the bottom of the chart. First, Mary Leakey found in Tanzania footprints in a stratum dated 3.8 million years. They had been studied and found to be remarkably human in all detectable morphological features. Did man live at the same time or before as Australopithecus afarensis, that is Lucy, and before Homo habilis, before Australopithecus africanus? In spite of the evidence, Richard Tuttle says, if the G footprints were not known to be so old, we would readily conclude that they were made by a member of our genus Homo. What that amounts to is, if the evidence doesn't fit the theory, disregard the evidence. And they have done that on this continent with evidence from what they call the Carboniferous period, before, when they think reptiles, dinosaurs, and birds appeared. There are apparent human footprints from that period in West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, and Illinois. But again, the book Fossil Men rejects them, saying, we must doubt where doubt is necessary. But we still haven't gotten back to our 4.5 million year notation on the chart. Apart from the footprints, the oldest hominid fossil dates to that time using the evolutionary time scale. Hominid has to do with higher apes and men. And this oldest hominid fossil, known as the Canopoi elbow, appears to be human. How reliable is that description? Listen to William Howell. He says, the humeral fragment from Canopoi, with a date of about 4.4 million, could not be distinguished from Homo sapiens morphologically, or by multivariate analysis by Pattern and myself in 1967, or by much more searching analysis by others since then. We suggested that it might represent Australopithecus because at that time allocation to Homo seemed preposterous, although it would be the correct one without the time element. They found something that was apparently human, but it did not fit in their evolutionary scale, and so they did as they have constantly done before. They reclassified it for their convenience, not accepting the evidence simply as it was. But why don't they arbitrarily just date it more recently, as they chose other dates? That question puts a finger on the problem. Certain rocks, locations, and strata have already been previously dated for the evolutionary convenience of what was found there. When later discoveries occur that don't fit with the index fossils, they must classify them as something else or disregard it. That is what happened to Richard Leakey's KNMR 1470. Remember, it was man for the first few years, but it threw evolution into such confusion. He was demoted to Homo habilis, thus evolutionist, rather than lose the significance of earlier finds, deny the obvious regarding anything that doesn't fit the theory. Concerning the canopoi elbow, the obvious puts man well before Homo erectus, the tongue child, Lucy, and Ramapithecus, or Ramapithecus, before everything that has to do with his supposed evolutionary ancestors. And regarding Lucy, dated just over 3 million years ago, to get to Homo sapiens, she had to undergo 5 million mutational changes in just 3 million years. That is almost 2 mutational changes a year, and that is unbelievable. Well, does the supposed sequence of Australopithecine and fossil hominids give us evolution? You know, the romantic sequences and arrangements we see in Time Life publications and National Geographic. Is this man's history? A few years ago, no one wanting to be considered intellectual would have denied it. But listen to these experts in the field, facing some of the things we have talked about. First of all, there is Richard Pilbeam, and he says, there is no clear-cut and inexorable pathway from ape to human being. Tremendous missing link, right? Mary Leakey, on the constructing of evolutionary family trees, says, in the present state of our knowledge, I do not believe it is possible to fit the known hominid fossils into a reliable pattern. But that doesn't stop the popular media, you will notice, or those who want to sell books sensationally. J.S. Jones and S. Rouhani say, the human fossil record is no exception to the general rule that the main lesson to be learned from paleontology is that evolution always takes place somewhere else. Camp there just a moment. When I was in school and growing up, the fossil record was supposed to be the great evidence of evolution. Even though, when you look back all the way, even to Darwin's time, he realized the problem he had with the fossil record. But it is still being presented that way. These scientists say it does not occur in paleontology. Evolution does not occur in the fossil record. It always occurs somewhere else. And we haven't found where else it occurs. What conclusion should that bring us to about this Darwinian theory of evolution? Then Robert Martin says, so one is forced to conclude that there is no clear-cut scientific picture of evolution. Well, having presented all of that information, I want to read from Marvin Lubenow in his book, The Bones of Contention, this summary of the material we have presented in the latter part of this lecture this evening. He says, the facts of the big picture are that first, fossils that are indistinguishable from modern humans can be traced all the way back to 4.5 million years ago, according to the evolutionary timescale. That suggests that true humans were on the scene before the Australopithecines appear in the fossil record. Anatomically, modern Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, archaic Homo sapiens, and Homo erectus all lived as contemporaries at one time or another. None of them evolved from a more robust to a more glacial condition. In fact, in some cases, Neanderthal and archaic Homo sapiens, the more robust fossils, the more primitive looking fossils, are the more recent fossils in their respective categories. There are no fossils of Australopithecus or of any other primate stock in the proper time period to serve as evolutionary ancestors to humans. As far as we can tell from the fossil record, when humans first appear in the fossil record, they are already human. And finally, this statement. The popular myth is that the hominid fossil evidence virtually proves human evolution. The reality is that this evidence has been a disappointment to evolutionists and is being de-emphasized. In actuality, the human fossil evidence falsifies the concept of human evolution. And that brings us back to the statement we closed with last evening concerning the book, The Evolution of Life by Pierre P. Grasset. This man is editor of the 28 volumes of The Traits of Zoology. He is president of the French Academy of Science. He has the utmost respect of the scientific community, and his book was written to destroy the myth of Darwinian evolution. And this is the closing statement of that book. It is possible that in this domain, biology, impotent, yields the floor to metaphysics. That says biology has not given us the answer. And we have just seen that paleontology does not give us the answer. And we may have to look at non-natural explanations for the existence of life. I believe I know where to find it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. Thank you.